It's Friday, everybody. It's Friday, November 11th. I'm Dave Weisberger, CEO of CoinRoutes, and it's time for This Week in Crypto. And this week, frankly, all I really want to do is rant. I kind of feel like Grandpa Simpson wanting to shake my hands at the clouds in terms of what's happened at FTX. And to put this in context, I'd rather like to tell a story. We'll start with poker. I've never believed that anybody who had $1 billion, much less 10 or 15 billion, would ever be willing to sacrifice everything for a marginal extra billion, because what good would it do? The best analogy I could come up with has to do with the literal dumbest thing I have ever seen at the poker table in many years of playing, tournament poker. So I was in Las Vegas at the Rio playing in a satellite to try to win a seat into the World Series of Poker. Now the structure of that event is the top 20 people at the end got a seat, each worth $10,000. The 21st person got a few $100 and that was it. The first person got a $10,000 seat. The 20th person got a $10,000 seat. Didn't matter where you were. At the point in time that the story starts, there were 25 of us left. One person had half the chips at the table, had a dominant lead. One other person had a third of that amount, and then the rest of it was pretty evenly distributed among the rest of us. At one point, the following hand happens. The button is the person with a third of the chips, the second highest chip count, but a third of the largest chip count. He moves all in. The biggest chip stack was in the big blind. Looks down, sees pocket tens, and calls. That may have been one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. But to explain why it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen, understand the odds. The fact is there was 99.999% likelihood that this person could have folded every single hand and made it to the top 20. We would have had to play for another 2+ hours for him to have gotten to the point where he needed to play a hand. So there was no need, there was no marginal benefit in winning the chips unless he prioritized his sleep in knocking out somebody that highly. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Moreover, having played with the gentleman who moved all in, the only hands you were going to see were going to be probably, maybe jacks, but probably not, kings, queens, or aces, or ace-king. That was pretty much it, because he knew with a chip stack that was the second largest, he didn't need to play that many, and he was a smart player. So sure enough, he turns over ace-king. The guy with pocket tens puts down the pocket tens. An ace hits on the flop. No muss, no fuss. Boom. Now the new chip leader. Now we have two chip stacks that are both leading everybody in the table, more or less the same. Several hands later, nobody's been knocked out. It literally was unbelievable. Several hands later, nobody gets knocked out. The guy who originally had the second biggest chip leader raises. Actually, no, that's not true. The original chip leader raises. The other guy re-raises significantly, like a third of their stacks. The original chip leader goes all in. Or actually, the original chip leader re-raises him. This guy raises all in. He calls. Now, after a raise and a re-raise from the first guy, there was almost no doubt of what hand he had. Basically, at that point, he had aces or kings because he knew he didn't need to play for that kind of stakes. So sure enough, the original guy with the third of the chips turns over aces, and the other guy turns over ace-king, where he had virtually no chance. He loses, boom. Two hands, he went from 99.99999% chance of winning to out of the tournament making zero. When I look at what Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX did this week, it feels exactly the same. Sure, it seemed fairly likely that, from what we can deduce, that post the Luna debacle, post the 3 Hours debacle, post the GBTC spread widening, that Alameda was likely toast. Sure. So you have, roughly speaking, these numbers are probably wrong, but they're probably not that far off. Let's say $8 billion out of your $15 billion fortune is in Alameda that it just vaporized. So what do? You take $7 billion that's left, and you risk it all to try to save the $8 billion. That is literally as dumb as the guy who lost in poker, because now you've gone from the world's richest person under the age of 30 to someone who probably, unless he's hidden assets from potential creditors, worth nothing. Certainly, he has no net worth outside of whatever cash and physical assets he's managed to buy, and who knows whether he'll hold on to it. Arguably the dumbest risk management move ever. But the thing that makes it ridiculous is the things that Sam has said in the past. So as it turns out, I did a podcast with Sam in the summer. And I'm going to be publishing an annotated version of this at some point, not in a very near future. But he said a few things that are fascinating. So in and around minute 26 of that podcast, we were talking about the real-time liquidation engine at FTX and how important it was. And we were discussing the notion of when you have to liquidate a position. And Sam says, well, in the end, if there's no collateral or no value to the collateral left, and I quote, you just can't pretend. And you need to understand that when you sell that collateral, it will have impact. So when you look at this situation, if he had just listened to his own advice, we wouldn't have gotten here. Worse, later in the same conversation, he basically said that people who don't run real-time risk engines, who don't have a liquidation engine, are essentially, and I quote again, putting their hands over their eyes. That's what he said. Let that absorb for a second. Had Sam Bankman-Fried listened to himself, and it was clear from the chronology that at that time he had already dug $1 billion hole vis-a-vis Alameda. If he had just listened to himself and stopped there, you'd have millions of depositors and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people whose savings were severely damaged, not damaged. So yes, I'm angry. The problem with the anger is there will be people in Congress, there will be people in politics who think that we should take this anger righteously and crush the crypto industry because look what it allowed to happen. And that's the wrong lesson. The right lesson is to understand that this drama does not invalidate the simple fact that Bitcoin and most smart contracts are designed in a way to be verifiable, designed in a way for self-custody to work, and designed in a way for dedicated custodians taking advantage of that verifiability can ensure customer deposits. It's not the obscure street name idea of DTCC. It doesn't rely on ledgers. Ledgers that are held by single firms. It literally relies on that. So what have we done? We've deified firms. We've deified people and given them money without taking advantage of any of those characteristics. That's a problem. And so that's one thing to understand. It doesn't invalidate the asset class. I'm just as bullish today as I was in the past, only I understand that a lot of people who got burned are going to feel burned and are not going to trust that asset class. The other thing it means is that it underscores the need for reasonable principles-based regulation and doing so soon. When Gary Gensler starts talking about how his regulations would protect this, he's not only disingenuous, he's absolutely lying. Worse, he is partially culpable in this situation for two reasons. Reason number one, directly, and reason number two, indirectly. Directly, by saying no to Grayscale's ETF application, the widening of the discount of that product, GBTC, which was held to the tune of billions of dollars, widened from a 20-some-odd% to a 35% discount. It's since widened to actually more than that. And he knew that this was an issue because he had investigated BlockFi, who had this trade on earlier in the summer. They had since, I think, gotten out of it. But all the proprietary traders, the lenders, etc., and as it turns out, Three Arrows and also Alameda were in this trade. Now, him denying the application, if it were justified, I guess you could say, well, I broke a few eggs because I did the right thing. But in reality, his reasoning was unjustified. The fact is he's allowed a futures-based ETF, which has exactly the same exposure, only it is less efficient than an ETF. It has more risk than an ETF. Yet Grayscale's subscribers, the people who own this, have lost billions of dollars because of his decision. And let's make no mistake about it, GBTC, which can be owned in any brokerage account in the United States, has been the only way to invest in Bitcoin from a brokerage account for a very long time until this inferior futures-based product. So he contributed to the discount by having an alternative and at the same time denying the ability for a better product, knowing the impact on the plumbing of the industry. The indirect is easy because Gary has steadfastly forced the world to try to be embroiled in a dispute over jurisdiction. He eschewed the notion of a safe harbor. He eschewed the notion of working with the industry. He eschewed the notion of doing anything to write new rules, saying many times our rules are good enough for equities, they're good enough for crypto. But they're not. Equities does not have the ability for self-custody. Equities does not have the ability for on-demand settlement. Equities does not have the ability to trade a commodity against a security in the same transaction. Equities does not have a lot of the characteristics that have been grown into the crypto market. And so it is disingenuous to say that it is. More importantly, equities is something very important because equities are held in street name and the bankruptcy laws have been written with cognition. If any market brokerage firm goes out of business, their customers can look through to the custodian and still get their assets. Even though we have something called SIPC, which protects them, that's not really even the important point. The point is people can get title to their assets. In the crypto world, there's no way to do it. There's rumors out there that the preferred stock investors in FTX might be superior to asset holders from the FTX platform in a bankruptcy situation. I strongly hope that's not true. But if it is true, it points out the need for immediate action legislatively to be able to allow firms to protect their depositors. Because right now, that's not clear. The second thing that a child could understand is that we need laws to actually, and regulation or someone to be able to prove that firms that have principal trading arms or risk-taking arms can be insulated from the deposit-taking arms. And people who buy with no leverage should have no risk to the leverage-taking operation that might be happening, and certainly no risk to proprietary trading or principal-based trading that's happening. And right now we have no way to do that because we don't have one regulator who has a composite view of these firms. Those are the lessons we need to learn. We need to push forward with crypto regulation, but not in a prescriptive way, in a principles-based way. The fact of the matter is there's one other point here that will also get ignored by people, and that is the lack of reasonable regulation in the United States effectively forced most of the trading in crypto derivatives and in crypto offshore. FTX, which exploded, what exploded was the offshore entity. Yes, it looks like it's dragged the U.S. entity down with it, or at least into the bankruptcy proceeding, but it was the offshore entity. So when U.S. congresspeople rave and say, we should do something, well, you know what? If you had done something 3 years ago when Hester Peirce suggested a safe harbor and suggested Congress writing laws giving the authority to be clear between the CFTC and the SEC, and an editorial that she and Commissioner Carolyn Pham wrote over a year ago, suggesting a way forward, if you had listened to that, we wouldn't have this problem. Because then U.S. investors would have had an on-ramp towards investing in companies that had a regulatory structure. But that was not the case here. Okay. Where does this leave us? This leaves us with a mess. We know what's going to happen. And I'm sorry for the length of this rant, but the reality is there are probably multiple firms that are going out of business that no one realizes yet. Why? Because FTX was the most capital efficient platform for people to take risk. What that also meant, it was the most capital efficient platform for people to hedge risk. Therefore, many not well capitalized market making firms used FTX for all of their or most of their risk taking and risk hedging activities. We do not know the full inventory of this yet. This is going to come out in the market. But what we have seen empirically at CoinRoutes testifies to this. Over the last week, today versus a week and a half ago, the order book in Bitcoin alone has thinned out precipitously. Over a week ago, if I wanted to sell 1,000 Bitcoin, I could have done so for 20 or 30 basis points of impact. Today, it's closer to 90 basis points or 1% of impact. If I wanted to sell 2,500 Bitcoin, which is a large order, basically $50 million, give or take back then, I would have had somewhere between, 0.75% of market impact on average, a little bit more during off hours, a little bit less during on hours. Today, that number is more like 4%. The books have thinned. It means that people who take liquidity are going to pay a lot more for it. Now, interestingly, and this is the last only commercial part of the blog I will say, is that CoinRoutes, which does mostly passive posting flow, actually is performing better than we used to because there's less market makers to compete with us in these order books. So the result is our clients are actually getting the same kind of transaction costs, arguably less than they did a week and a half ago, when most of our competitors are paying dramatically more. So I could be happy about this, but as you can tell from my tone here, I am not particularly happy because I've seen the industry get a black eye. The fact is there is a need for better rules. There is a need to enforce against proprietary trading. And lastly, there is a need to enforce what collateral is. When you take collateral, if you take T-bills, for example, it's good for that. If you take T-bills for 1 or 2 days, you can get the money back, it's no question. If you take cash, hell, if you take Bitcoin, it's liquid, you can get it done. So if you're a DeFi platform that's claiming that, only these humans are great, or bad, DeFi is going to be great, well, understand, most DeFi platforms that claim to be over-collateralized ask for 150% of collateral. And that sounds like a lot. But if they take collateral in a coin whose liquidity has vanished, it is entirely possible that selling any reasonable amount of that particular coin could knock the price down more than 50%. In fact, with FTT, that's exactly what happened. It dropped by 75%. And FTT was taken by FTX as good collateral. The net of this very geek conversation about collateral is DeFi platforms are only as good as the liquidity of the collateral they take. The same is true for centralized exchanges. The fact is, any reasonable regulation would have some notion of what is good collateral and some notion of quantitatively assessing it. Okay, I've talked about a lot. It's been a tough week. Time to relax for the weekend. Hopefully some of you can do so. I know there's a lot of pain out there, and I just wish everyone the best. Take care and have the best weekend you can.